ti, ka rua ti, ka harama ki ka titore, ka rauna, ka luho te kiwi, e koa he mai taki no pi no pā, ka hua mai kai ana te whatū, kai ana te marama, ko te tio rere I runga rā, ka rua tōna pe ka ti he muriona. Tēnā rā anei anō me ki te haukaina, tuatahi ki te whare wānanga o tāmaki, tēnā anō hoki ko te ahoranga o te mātauranga me te tauwhiro tangata, nei rā te ringa pohi, te reo karanga ki ia konohi o koutou, ki ia konohi o koutou, ka te mea nau mai haramai. Kia ora rā e te mā reikura, Louise, tēnā koe ke te mihatu. Me ki e kore te mihi kupu e mutu mō, nei rā tō pō whakahira, kia ora rā. On behalf of the University and Faculty of Education and Social Work, my pleasure to welcome you and congratulate you in this, your evening of presentation, your inaugural evening. Kia ora rā, ngā mihi tēnā, kia ora rā. Tēnā tā.
Kia ora.
Te
aloha, te whakarongo, me tēnā mai Māori e tātou e.
Kia ora rā, huri no ki ngā mā tāwaka, tēnā tātou. Kia ora rā.
Well, I get a great pleasure of introducing Professor Louisa Allen's inaugural lecture at the University of Auckland. Louisa's scholarship is concerned with sexuality and schooling. She works in the best tradition of critical studies in education, which, since the 1970s, has been concerned with looking inside the black box of schools and classrooms to understand what is really going on beneath the surface. What is it that produces the inequalities, the structured divisions, and changes our society? So it really is a critical study in education, and I'm very proud to be able to introduce that as head of Christie, our school. Louisa's career has coincided, I won't speak for very long, by the way, that's a very short one, but I have a few things to say. So, Louisa's career has coincided with, and indeed contributed in many ways to, the proliferation of growing studies which acknowledge the diversity of human sexuality and feeling and bodily emotion. 20 years ago, it would have been impossible to have put a slide with a title called Breathing Life into Sexuality Education without that being somehow some sort of clever metaphor. And what I know tonight is that we will be informed by a very materialist, grounded, embodied form of thinking about breathing life, the vitalism, which reflects the cultural and the vitalist turns in the social sciences in general. So Louisa is ahead of the curve and is part of that sort of growing movement and recognition that life is about breathing, living, sharing, and emoting, and all of those things which are so central. And I like to think that one of Roger Dale, who was Professor Roger Dale from the University of Bristol and Auckland, who was one of Louisa's mentors, would have been very proud of this moment, because Roger always used to say, if you want to understand anything about schooling or education, the last place you would look is in schools or in education. Go outside, read widely, find out more about what is going on in the world, and then come back 4 or 5 years later to apply them to these things. So, it's very tempting at this point to start listing major awards and major grants, and I'm not going to do that. They are available on Louisa's website, and you can do that. Much more important, I think, is to recognise that professorial lectures such as this set the scholarly tone and the intellectual climate of the university as a whole. They are moments where we celebrate the personal project that has brought an individual academic and scholar to the point where they are standing in front of the public and in front of the family, who have come all the way from Browns Bay and managed to sneak some wine into the front row as well, against statute number 28.2 of the University Code. But good luck to you. So it's really important to recognise the personal and academic goals, and this is a moment of public recognition. So without that, I'm going to stop. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Louisa to us. You know her already. And Louisa, I really hope you enjoy the lecture, and this is your night and your occasion, so good luck. Thank you. Thanks.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I aku nui, I aku rahi. Kua hui mai e tēnei wā. Māori ora, Māori tau, kia tātou. Ka mihi o ki toku papa a Bob Allen, ki toku mama a Lorraine Allen, ki toku hoa rangatira a Andrew, ki taku tama a Otis. Ara kia koutou katoa, I oku hoa mahi, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko rangitoto te maunga, ko pupuki te roto, ko onimaiwao te moana. Ko rohaparaha te pā. Ko Louisa Allen aho, tēnā koutou katoa. No, it's just, it was such a pleasure to be able to do that, and I wanted to thank Hinikura for helping me to put that together. Welcome everybody. It is so wonderful to have so many people that I love in the room all at once. When you put a professorial application together, it is a mammoth undertaking. It's about 50 pages, right? And it takes quite a while because it needs to span your entire career. And recently, I've been on a mentoring program for our faculty, and I've had to go back to this application and look at the first 500 words that I wrote in order to give it to the mentees that are on the program. And I realised, gosh, what a lot of people helped me put that application together, and what a lot of people so many people have supported me in my career to date. In my pepeha, I thanked my family, my father and my mother, Lorraine Allen, for always instilling in me a love of knowledge and education, and supporting me financially to be able to get a degree in the early years. I thanked also my husband and son Otis, whose love and support really are wonderful for me every day. I couldn't do this job without them. I wanted to thank my friends in the audience here, some of whom I have known since we were 6 years old. You're precious to me. And I also wanted to thank all the teachers, all the lecturers and mentors who have seen me to this point. Really, you've been so generous with your knowledge and your time and your kindness. And it is so important to thank people. I think thanking people is very, very needed. See, I told you, 50 pages, right? These are just the ones that I can remember. Look for your name, I'm sure you'll find it there. I also wanted to say something to the people. I know that this is being live streamed out all across the world, and I wanted to say hello to Antonia in Austria, and also Liz in Austria, and also my friend Mary Lou in Australia, because I know that they're watching tonight. So one more thank you to Helen. Where are you, Helen? Helen is an amazing person who has organised this event tonight. When we had to move the venue, she said, don't worry, it'll be seamless. And it was. So thank you, Helen. Okay, let's begin. So I have entitled this address, Breathing Life into Sexuality Education. The idea of breathing life into education comes from the feminist philosopher Sharon Todd. In her keynote address to the Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia conference, which I know that some of you were lucky enough to attend, it was in Newcastle last year, Todd describes breathing life into education as a method for navigating the way certain approaches to education can be stifled. She refers to the way education more generally has become preoccupied with foci such as performance. So for instance, how many schools that get the most NCEAs and the most passes are seen to be the best kind of schools, right? So the performance of the school is deemed to be based on the amount of NCEA passes. Or within universities, the sense that the universities with the most A-rated PBF researchers are the best universities. Todd also talks about how education has become preoccupied with managerial standardisation. And one small example in our university is when we had to change our course booklets so that they had standardised wording in them around, for instance, plagiarism and other regulations to do with the students' statements about course objectives and requirements. And these statements can position students in ways that can be patronising and antithetical to learning. These kind of foci, she argues, leave most of us gasping for air and longing for spaces to breathe. This is because they serve to standardise the experiences of education that stifle creativity in learning and teaching. They attempt to regulate the unknown and tame the student and teacher who does not conform to the standard template. The delight, and of course sometimes discomfort, of random, unexpected surprises in teaching and learning is squeezed from these experiences, leaving us deflated, disenchanted, and immobile. Breathing life into education, as Todd conceives it, is an approach to education which is life-enhancing. It is a call to a recognition of our senses and the sensual. The embodied act of breathing in and out, which is both so taken for granted that we hardly notice it, and yet at the same time so fundamental to life and a sustaining act. I would argue that this mundane yet vital act of life is also a form of resistance. And to illustrate, I want to give you an example from a book that I recently read. The book is written by Heather Morris. She is a New Zealand-born author, and she has written the story of Lale Sokolov, who was a Jew born in Slovakia. Now that's him pictured there with his wife that he met in Auschwitz. Now, Lale becomes the tattooist of Auschwitz-Birkenau, marking prisoners' arms with a 4-digit number by which they are to be identified in camp. And it's a form of dehumanisation that Lale cannot understand and absolutely abhors, but an act which ultimately enables him to survive 4 years in a place where very few did. His enforced labour as a tattooist leaves him with this terrible guilt, the guilt that he lived when so many others did not. And there is a moment in this story which highlights for me the vital and resistant nature of breath. At the end of the horror of his first day in camp, Lale makes a vow to himself, and it's written there on the screen. I will live to leave this place. I will walk out a free man. He vows to keep breathing as a form of resistance to the unimaginable inhumanity he experiences around him. In Auschwitz, breath could not be taken for granted. It was easily taken away, and its presence in the body of prisoners was a sign of defiance. I offer this grave example because it shows so acutely the power of breath, the simple act of breathing in and out at a symbolic and material level is so much more than a mundane action. On a very different human scale, I want to suggest that breathing life into sexuality education in ways that attempt to revitalise the old issues and problems which plague this area of education is also a form of resistance. Todd's idea of breathing life into education has caught my attention for several reasons, and it's an especially apt metaphor for sexuality education, because sexuality education is often critiqued by students for literally sucking the life out of a subject which has at its core the body and the sensual. And this life-sucking quality stems from the fact that a core aim of sexuality education in Western contexts has been a focus on preventing so-called negative consequences of sexual activity, like, for instance, unplanned pregnancy. So this means that instead of sexuality education being life-enhancing in the way that Todd conceives of it, of breathing life into education, historically, sexuality education has been ironically devoid of sensual bodies, pleasures, and desires. What I want to do this evening is to trace some of the ways I understand the field of sexuality education leaves us gasping for air. And I want to make an argument for the ways in which the field has stagnated around some key issues which we just can't seem to get past. And this isn't just in Aotearoa, but also in the field internationally. And these issues are not exclusive to sexuality education, right? They are endemic across schooling in its entirety. Now, the first of these issues is homophobia, or fear of dislike of homosexual and gay people. And the second is how to successfully engage with cultural and religious diversity in student populations. And so to do this work, I'm going to take you on a journey of some parts of my research which highlight some of these enduring challenges in the field of sexuality education. And my aim is to ultimately arrive at the question of how might we reimagine sexuality education? Now, I'm not, and this is going to be very disappointing for some of you, I'm not going to provide necessarily answers because although I'm going to draw on Sharon Todd's ideas, there are no simple answers to these issues. They're very complex, and I don't believe that there are single approaches. But I want to offer further propositions and provocations which open space for others to join this conversation. Now, when I first started researching in this area, in the area of sexuality education, I looked at the official curriculum first, right? I was interested in understanding what kinds of messages sexuality education offered young people about sexuality and their sexual identities. And in the course of this research, young people told me that although sexuality education was very useful, and some bits of it were at least a little bit useful, it wasn't the main source of the information that they got at school about sexuality. They also got a lot of information from the unofficial curriculum, and that is from the kinds of conversations that they might have with peers, from interactions between their teachers and watching their teachers and other students interact. And they found this information extremely useful because it filled in some of the gaps that they didn't, of knowledge that they weren't getting from sexuality education. Around, for instance, exactly what sexual activity is, because sexuality education hardly ever broaches that, how to ask someone out, or how to end a relationship. So the unofficial curriculum in schools can be likened to what we call in education the hidden curriculum, that which is learned but not intentionally taught. And these micro moments occur many times every day in schools, right? And some examples from my own research are, for instance, and I've seen this several times when I've been out in schools, I'll be out in the playground and one student calls another student a fag, and a teacher is walking past, and that teacher does not intervene in that moment. Now, in that moment, a huge amount is learnt about sexuality. We learn that being called a fag is not a good thing, that it is a denigrated term, that heterosexuality is central, and that the teacher legitimises that. The teacher believes that it is okay to allow one student to call another student a fag in those instances. Another example of an unofficial learning of about sexuality at school is when schools provide toilets marked male and female, but none marked all gender, so that gender diverse students have nowhere to relieve themselves, or they must risk entering a toilet in which their gender might actually be challenged. So it's not an official part of the curriculum, but those instances are moments in which learning about sexuality and gender are offered. And it was these particular moments that I wanted to explore when I received an Early Career Research Excellence Award from the University of Auckland. Thank you, University of Auckland. It was a 2-year project, and it was looking at the sexual cultures of schooling. And because it was the kind of project that was looking at unofficial learnings about sexuality, I couldn't go to the curriculum directly. I couldn't go to policy documents. I needed to be able to explore this area with a methodology that was quite unconventional. So I don't know what possessed me, but I decided that photo methods would be a good idea to gain some data from schools around sexuality. And the ethics around this was really difficult to negotiate. I think I was quite green at the time in terms of not realising how difficult it would be to give students cameras that they could go into school and take photos of how they learnt about sexuality. But that's another lecture, we won't go there tonight. And I've written about it in many places. So I asked the students, I couldn't say to them, can you please take photos of the unofficial culture of schooling, because I mean, what does that mean? I didn't even know myself. I said to them, can you take photos of every time you see something sexual at school, because that'll be a moment in which you're actually learning about sexuality. So I gave them the disposable cameras, and they took photos across 2 weeks, or 1 week, and then they came back to me, we developed the films, and we talked about them. And these are some of the photos. This photo was one that was shown across several of the photo diaries that the young people put together. They were in the last 2 years of secondary school, so they were that's old school, 7th form, year 12 and 13. And they said, we learn a lot about sexuality at school from watching couples in relationships. We get a sense of what a normal relationship is from seeing other couples interact. And so there were lots of photos of opposite gendered couples holding hands. Another unofficial learning of sexuality, this particular one was taken by a young woman who told me she learnt quite a lot from this graffiti on her desk, because she came from a family of 4 girls and she didn't have any brothers, and so I don't know if you can see it particularly clearly, but someone has etched a penis into the desk and they've written cock underneath. And the young woman said, well, that was quite useful because it looked semi-erect, so I kind of got a sense of what that would look like. Because sexuality education doesn't offer those kinds of insights into sexuality. If you ever it doesn't. No erect penises. Another image was this one taken by Danny, who said that the boys' locker room was a really important space for learning about sexuality in 2 ways. The first way was that it enabled him to compare his own physical development with that of other boys to see if he was normal. So he could check out other boys' bodies, and then he could see whether or not he was developing at the same rate. The other way it became useful for learning about sexuality was it was a space that was not well patrolled or policed by teachers, because they have a fear of coming into gym locker rooms these days in case students are, don't have without clothes. So they usually just put their heads through the door and they say, "Oi, you lot, hurry up!" Which means that students can sit there and talk about whatever they want. And so Danny said he learnt a lot in these moments about sexuality, about relationships, about the sorts of things that people were doing in relationships without that surveillance from teachers. This rather grainy picture is a result of the fact that the Ethics Committee wanted me to ensure that the identity of participants couldn't be seen in photos. So we've got the faces are pixelated here. But when I was given this image, I thought, this hasn't got anything to do with sexuality. Why has this person taken this photo? The young man who took it because he said, "I'm really annoyed with the teachers. The way they always think that when you're talking to someone of the opposite gender, that it's always sexual. Like, why do they always assume that about us, that we are constantly thinking about sex and that we can't just talk?" So this particular image was, he named it "just talking," and the fact that young people can just talk. The last image, also with pixelated faces, was taken by a young woman of her two friends who were out lesbians at school. She said that they were one of the only lesbian couples in her school, and she was good friends with them, and she really didn't like the amount of discrimination that they experienced at school. In fact, at one point, they'd been in the schoolyard, and a group of young women had come over to her friends and started hurling abuse. And so she had tried to intervene, stood between these women, and got punched. So, the person who took this photo wanted to show that school is pretty homophobic in lots of ways, and that this is one of the things that she has learnt from being at school. Now, one of the things that I learnt from this study was the way schools are stifling of students' sexuality and the way that they leave them gasping for air, largely because schools are heteronormative. And that is, they centre heterosexuality, as seen in that most of the photos taken of couples were of opposite gender couples. That schools position young people as particular sexual subjects, where their sexuality is seen as a risk to themselves and to others. That young people are always seen to be sexually voracious. They're always thinking about sex. They can't just talk to each other without having something sexual on their minds. I also learnt that sexuality is not a life-enhancing characteristic of identity at school, but it's mainly taboo, embarrassing, wrong, except in certain forms like heterosexuality and circumstances like marriage or committed relationships. If you compare this kind of culture of schooling, unofficial culture of schooling, to the sorts of things that young people themselves know about sexuality, that they access from other realms of their lives, like digital media, the internet, social media platforms, popular music, television, film and teen fiction, how can we possibly expect sexuality education to reach young people with important messages about safer sex, for instance, when it is so divorced from their everyday realities and interests? When it doesn't speak to them in ways that recognise their desire and pleasure for same-gendered couples. And there's a kind of didactic nature to sexuality education that emphasises risk and danger and avoids pleasure and desire, so that it just kind of feels, sexuality education feels like a lecture from an annoyed parent who wants you to do what they want you to do. So if we're really committed to supporting our young people to grow into healthy and happy citizens, then why don't we address them positively and legitimately as sexual subjects in ways that take account of their real lives? And this is an issue around which we have become stuck in sexuality education. How do we actually give young people the kind of information that resonates with their actual lives, instead of constantly focusing on risk and danger and the things that that are negative about sexuality and not life-enhancing? So it's a challenge that continues to plague sexuality education in New Zealand and internationally. Another one of these enduring issues in sexuality education that I want to turn to now, and I'm going to go back to this image because it encapsulates it really well, is the prevalence of homophobia in schools. Now, for many of us who work in the field of sexuality education in the audience, homophobia is a villain that just will not die. No matter how much effort we put into kind of trying to eradicate it, it just keeps popping up. However, there's this kind of more general perception within a public perception, I think more, that homophobia is declining. And this idea is also being advanced in some academic quarters, with books written on, for instance, the declining significance of homophobia, that's the title of one of these books, in schools, by Mark McCormack in the UK. Now, Mark McCormack argues that young men no longer rely on homophobia as the main way in which they construct and maintain their masculine identities. But in my research, I've found very little evidence of this declining significance of homophobia. What I have found is that what homophobia looks like has changed. It's morphed into something that is less discernible than hate or fear of homosexuals. And historically, homophobia has been understood as an extreme and irrational aversion to homosexuality and homosexual people. It may no longer be acceptable to say outrightly homophobic things like being gay is wrong because it's against God, right? But that does not mean that people are no longer homophobic or less homophobic. What homophobia looks like is configured differently in the current moment, but I'm yet to be convinced that it is less prevalent. I guess I need to have a conversation with McCormack at some time. But to illustrate this point, I want to provide an example of how homophobia currently presents itself in the research that I have been doing. And this comes from a conversation with a young woman named Gabby, who's very typical of the young women and young people in my research. She comes from a school with a very comprehensive sexuality education program where sexual diversity is actually part of the curriculum. I know because I sat in her class while her teacher actually talked about lesbian, gay, bisexual issues. So I know she got that information. And interestingly, her health teacher is an out lesbian herself. And Gabby got on really well with her teacher. She said that she really liked her teacher and she admired the fact that she was actually out to students. And in fact, when I interviewed Gabby, she said to me that she really disliked the way that some of the other students in the class treated this out lesbian teacher. And she said, there were these girls, they were like, I don't want to change when she, the teacher's, in the locker room anymore. And so Gabby says, I think that's pure frigging ignorance, actually. I think that's so rude to be like, oh, I don't want to get changed now in case she hits on me. Like, what the hell? Who do you think you are? That makes me so angry. So you can see that she is aware of discrimination and she's not happy about this treatment with her teacher. Yet while Gabby sees this treatment of her teacher as unjust, she also says the following a little later in the interview. And we're actually talking about the fact that there are not many Gabby says there aren't many out gay or lesbian students at her school, and I said to her, well, why do you think that is? Why do you think that young people aren't out who are gay and lesbian at your school? And her response goes like this. This just proves it's not always very accepted, and I think that even though people are sort of like, it's okay to be gay, it's awesome, you know, whatever, really it's not, because it's kind of strange. I mean, it's fine. My mum is really, really judgmental. That makes me real angry, but I have nothing to say to anyone that's gay. It's none of my business. I'm like, that's great. I hope you guys have a loving relationship. As long as you're happy, that's friggin' awesome. She liked the word friggin'. I have nothing at all to say about, even though I'm Christian, and obviously it's wrong in my religion to do that, but I'm not the judge of that. I'm not going to be like, that's wrong. It's nothing to do with me. So yeah, that's my opinion on same-sex couples. What I find interesting here is that Gabby likes her teacher, and she's willing to defend her against homophobic comments from other students, at the same time as she believes that being gay is kind of strange. While liking her teacher and admiring her out gay identity, she also distances herself from gayness by saying, I have nothing to say to anyone that's gay. It's none of my business. She also casts gay as being morally wrong when she says, I'm Christian and obviously it's wrong in my religion. Yet she simultaneously insists, I'm not the judge of that. I'm not going to be like that's wrong. It's nothing to do with me. All the while, these sentiments are wrapped up in good wishes. I hope you guys have a loving relationship as long as you're happy. This is not a homophobia based on hate and ignorance. Gabby is knowledgeable about sexual diversity from her house class and her out lesbian teacher, whom she genuinely likes and believes should not have to endure homophobic discrimination. Yet simultaneously, her words cast homosexuality as wrong, strange, not accepted, and against my religion. If we are going to try to reduce homophobia in schooling, we need to recognise that homophobia does not always look like we expect it to, that it's not always based on hate and ignorance. And these characteristics not only make it harder to identify, but much more challenging to address. I want to turn now to the issue of cultural and religious difference in sexuality education. And I've been very lucky to be part of an international research collaboration that received funding from the Australian Research Council that was looking at how might we engage with cultural and religious diversity in sexuality education. And that project was headed by Mary Lou Rasmussen in Australia. So my role was to head the Auckland-based element of this research, and it meant spending time in schools, or one particular school, and looking at the sexuality education curriculum as it was taught. I had an iPad in the class, and we actually recorded the lesson, and I interviewed the teacher and some of the students. The students were in year 10, and they were aged 13 and 14 years old, and we'd chosen a class that had high Māori and Pacifica numbers of students in the class. In fact, it was mainly Māori and Pacifica students. Because on our research team, we had a Māori researcher, and we thought that we were going in to look at a difference in terms of Māori and Pacifica students. I learnt such a lot about cultural and religious difference from this particular study. The first thing I learnt was the difference that I thought that I was coming to observe was actually not the difference I ended up noticing. And this is because when the class is full of Māori and Pacifica students, the locus of difference shifts. Māori and Pacifica become the norm, and then everybody else is different. And this included me, who was Pākehā and one of the only Pākehā Palangi people in the class, including the teacher and one other student. And then there was one other student who was different in the class, and I called her Carol. And I was really drawn to her from the first day of observation in that class. And I was drawn to her difference, because in a classroom full of Māori and Pacifica faces, hers stood out. It's because I'm not touching the screen enough. Carol was the only one wearing a hijab. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Carol was the only one wearing a hijab. Carol's family were refugees from Africa, and she was Muslim. I later learned when I interviewed her. She was also different in terms of her interactions in the class. So she always sat at the front of the class, right in front of the male teacher, whereas all the other girls in the class clumped themselves in the middle, and they were in friendship groups. She was also one of the only young women in the class to constantly ask questions. And so this made her stand out as well. When I interviewed Carol, I followed a predetermined script of questions that our research team had devised to explore cultural and religious diversity in the sexuality education classroom. And one of these questions went as follows. So I say, could sexuality education offer any other things about your culture or religion that you wanted to know more about or have recognised or mentioned? And Carol says, well, I mean, that's a hard thing to say because New Zealand isn't an Islamic country. It seems very Christian-based or something-based, and our school is mainstream. It's not really faith-based because even if they, meaning the teachers, did mention it, or they say it out of context, that's just going to give misunderstandings. Imagine if there wasn't actually a Muslim teaching it, who knew the same thing, and they said something else. It would just be like difficult. So you can see the earnest attempt of our research team, the question of our research team to kind of do the right thing, to acknowledge Carol's difference and to be inclusive and welcoming of its appearance in sexuality education. But Carol's response was not what the research team had been expecting. Instead of saying, yep, that's a great idea, I'd like more of my own culture and religion acknowledged and included in the curriculum, she expresses reluctance about such an inclusion. And while not outrightly refusing the idea, she's going to be a diplomat, this young woman, she rather politely says, that's a hard thing to say. It would be just like difficult. Carol doesn't want her own religious views included in the curriculum. She fears that a non-Muslim school would get it all wrong. She worries about being misrepresented. She worries that there's no teachers suitable to undertake this work who know the right things to say about being Muslim. She doesn't want to be an add-on to the curriculum. She doesn't even necessarily want to share her religion with the class. What would be the point? To let others know and possibly ridicule her own worldview? She told me that she got all of the info that she needed about sexuality outside of school from her local mosque. What more could she learn from its inclusion in sexuality education class at her school? Carol taught me much about approaching difference. When I entered that classroom and saw Carol as different, I did so in a way that many of our current educational practices and policies in education do. I recognised her difference in terms of a set of attributes or characteristics of differences. I wasn't seeing Carol for who she was. I was seeing Carol for what she was. That is a set of characteristics that made her different from the other students in the class. She was the only one wearing a hijab. Her facial features were African and not Māori or from the Pacific. She was a girl who asked questions when the other girls didn't. She was a Muslim girl who asked questions when my Eurocentric assumption was that Muslim girls do not ask questions about sexuality. In this rendition of difference, as Todd explains, diversity is shorthand for naming precisely those differences that need to be managed, since they create the conditions for conflict to arise. Thus, what undergirds such articulations of cultural diversity is the assumption that diversity is a problem, a source of social tension that needs to be remedied. In our project, we've been understanding diversity as a problem to be solved. Our questions position Carol as a problem that needed to be remedied in the classroom. Carol is Muslim. How do we cater to her? The problem with this orientation to difference is that it reduces Carol to a set of characteristics that she was not. She was not a quiet Muslim girl. She was not a student who wanted her differences catered for in the sexuality education classroom. Our approach to Carol's difference rendered her an individual who becomes a generalised figure read through her attributes. And I'm referring to Todd there. Now, in this last part of the lecture, I want to turn back to Todd to ask, how can we engage with these issues of cultural and religious difference and homophobia in ways that breathe life into education? When I read Carol as a set of generalised characteristics, as a hijab-wearing, quiet Muslim girl, what I lose is her uniqueness. For Todd, uniqueness is what appears when human beings come into relation with each other. It's a moment where what we are, not who we are, is made. And what this approach misses is that each encounter, each coming into relation, is itself unique. It might look the same or feel the same, but each encounter is in fact new. And we can liken this to the way that Todd explains breathing. And I'm quoting Todd here. To breathe is to undergo a unique encounter with the world each and every time. After all, no breath is ever repeated twice. Each breath is different from the next and occurs only in the here and now of living experience. And one of the things that I find most exciting about this notion of encountering others is the potential that it holds for change. If each encounter with others is new, then each encounter is an opportunity for things to be different in the here and now, but not in the usual ways we understand change to occur from newness, because the potential for change does not rest solely on the encounter being new. It involves an orientation to this encounter, which we need to cultivate in ourselves. It involves a concern with attention and openness to uncertainty, which Todd argues might be the foundation for how we approach education as a practice more generally. She says, my view is that education unfolds as a process of both attention and openness to uncertainty. That is, attention is poor if we already presume to know what it is we will hear. And openness is meaningless without direction towards something to which one is open. So in relation to issues of cultural and religious diversity in sexuality education, what this means is approaching teaching, research in these classrooms with an openness to uncertainty. It means not assuming what difference is in those classrooms before entering them, but letting difference unfold in the process of encounters with students. And this requires a certain openness to uncertainty and a kind of humility, where sexuality educators and researchers and teachers do not presume to know the difference of the other in advance of the encounter with them. It involves, and this is difficult for us as teachers, a tolerance for not knowing and a suspension of our own judgment, about what we know and what we think is right. And in relation to issues of homophobia, a similar openness to uncertainty is sought. It means not assuming that homophobia looks and sounds a certain way. That homophobia, for instance, finds expression only when it is based on hate and fear of homosexuals. Todd invites us to give attention to homophobia, and this is real attention, not a superficial survey of select words and actions of students. It involves a detailed, careful attention to how the experience of homophobia manifests in real life. It is a listening and a watching and awareness of our own defensiveness, which might find expression as the assertion that homophobia is declining in significance in schools. So is it possible to change things? Is it possible that one day we might have a world in which homophobia, racism, and religious intolerance and discrimination are a distant memory? Change may not look like we expect it to. And this is for the new materialists out there. Change is a perpetual potentiality and already becoming. Change is like breath. It is mundane and profound at the same time. As Todd says, with each physical inhalation and exhalation of air flowing through the body, breath is both at once singular and relational. It is a single body that breathes in, and yet the act of breathing is relational through the air that we share with others. So too is change around homophobia and racism and religious intolerance. This change is a singular act and a collective, life-sustaining responsibility. And I'd like to finish with a dedication. And I know that you're supposed to do dedications at the beginning, but you'll probably notice that I'm not much of a conformist. I'd like to dedicate this lecture to my previous teachers who've propelled me on this flight, to my family and my friends who embrace me in the now, and to my students, past and present, who are the future of the field. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Ina mana, ina reo, ina hoe wha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Barrow. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education and Social Work, and it falls to me to thank you all for your attendance here tonight. It's great to see so many of Louisa's family members, friends, students and colleagues in the audience. Thank you, Louisa, in particular, for your excellent address. Promotion to Professor is the highest academic accolade that the university can bestow on an academic staff member. As Louisa noted at the beginning, to promote an academic to the rank of Professor, the university enacts a rigorous review of her work to be assured of the excellence of her teaching, her research and her service. The process of Professor Allen's promotion ended here tonight with this inaugural address. Inaugurations of professors or masters and the rituals associated with them are traditions that stretch back to the very beginnings of the medieval university. Almost all the rituals involved the new professors paying for large doses of hospitality for his, and I use the pronoun advisedly, new colleagues, in some cases with feasting extending for several days or weeks. Somewhere along the way, the requirement for the new professor to provide food and drink for the university staff has been lost, something for which I'm sure Louisa is very grateful. However, the ritual that has survived is the inaugural lecture. Thus, this evening we have all participated in an event with a very long history and association with the Western University. I'm sure you will all agree with me that tonight, Louisa, in her inaugural address, has played her role well in preserving the tradition of the inaugural lecture. that she has provided us with ample evidence of her academic prowess and of her worthiness to be accorded the rank of Professor. I ask you all to join me once more in congratulating Professor Allen on her elevation to the rank of Professor.
Now everybody gets to go home. Yeah.